it's more like a discussion that I want to have with everyone than something that is actually kind of constructed. So the idea of system of provision emerged a bit at the intersection of political economy and ecological economics. And it's gaining a lot of momentum. So I'm curious a bit to know how it can concretely be used as part of a more prospective vision of society and concretely policy implementation by changing basically regional modes of provision, industrial production processes, and political decision over consumption and fundamental needs. I think it can open up a lot of interesting facts, but at the same time, the system of provision approach is still quite opaque. So trying to really unpack it, it's something that I think quite a couple of people are trying to do. But most of the knowledge is really around the people who created the approach. So I have the book here. I can send the link after. So the guide for system of provision approach by Kate Bayliss and Ben Fine. So they are the one who maybe are always a bit kind of central in how it's currently being used. So through collaboration, but also they sort of set the standard. So in a way, what I'm going to try to do is to talk a bit about the genesis of the idea, then describe some specific about the system of provision approach, how it works, sort of short masterclass of how it can be used. And that's based on the book, the articles that I sent, but also I talk with Kate Bayliss quite a lot. So I myself had a bit of a masterclass in this, so it's based also in what she says. And then I want to have a collective discussion to sort of pin down the potential for transition and identify how it can be useful for post-capitalist model and democratic planning. But I'm curious to know if there is like first impressions about the article from you. We can also discuss a bit later on. So I'll start with the origin of the framework and the link to ecological economics. So if we talk about the genesis, so the provisioning for human needs has really this long history in economics with Polanyi, but also a lot of feminist economic approach talk about provisioning, have provisioning as part of a central component of their identity. However, we know that in mainstream economic consumption and the conception of consumption from the mainstream is really what dominates. And it's very limited, both in the context of ecological crisis, that more consumption is more satisfaction of human needs. And also the mere definition of consumption itself in mainstream is extremely limited. There is a strong disjoint between the consumption and production side in mainstream, but also there's a large set of assumption about consumption or the distribution of consumption and how market would function in order to fulfill these consumption patterns. And so if we look at how these kind of critiques led to the emergence of the SOP approach, with then new thinker kind of being central, we have the strong critique of Ben Fine that since the 90s has been proposing a critique of consumption. There is a 5C framework, but also the system of provision approach that have been kind of two foundation of his work on consumption. He had also a quite extensive critique of the food industry, the food systems. So it sort of starts with this critique, and then it goes with what he proposes more about consumption goods, and then an analysis of food, and then Kate Bayliss and Mary Robinson, so the two other in the image, joined in the research agenda and brought in a critical take on public infrastructure and essential services. So Kate Bayliss is notably one of an expert in water systems, and Mary Robertson worked a lot on housing. There's also quite some work on electricity and other type of public infrastructure, public services. So in a way, it went from this kind of narrow, specific consumption of good to food as a system, so a bit more globally, and then public provisioning and social policy in the later stage, in this kind of third phase of the approach. So in this way, it's also a critique of the mainstream, where consumption relates not only to more or less optimal decision about shopping habits, but really the way in which people's basic needs are being met, and the structures that underline these things. So then this was proposed, and it was a bit picked up by ecological economists, notably the group in Leeds. And they sort of created a research agenda that sort of hypothesized a bit that it's a fruitful way to connect biophysical inputs, so resource use, and social outcome. So that led them to have a couple of research questions. So with this Lily project that started in Leeds, including people like O'Neill and Stenberger. The idea was to pose three main questions. The first one is, what are the biophysical resources, more specifically energy, that are required to achieve human well-being? The second question was, what influence do social and technical provisioning systems have on the level of resource use associated to well-being? And the last one is, if remaining within the planetary boundaries requires rapid decrease in resource use and energy use, how can these scarce resources best be employed to enhance and preserve well-being? So all of these things are really made for linking resource use and social outcome. So the idea of biophysical limits or input is really in line with the framework of planetary boundary. So the 9 planetary boundaries from the Stockholm Environmental Institute that I'm sure you know. And then the basic, the human needs framework. And in that way, that connects quite well with the framework of the donut. And what they do is that well-being is really defined with this idea of need satisfier, which is aligned with the kind of core author from ecological economics like Dallaire, Ian Goth, and and this idea is that the basic needs are universal, satiable, and non-substitutable, but also that they can be satisfied through need satisfier. And that's a way also to formalize the connection. They say in some way it can be mathematized, it can be connected. And if we want to reduce and increase and have this, we kind of need to know, is there any sort of country that managed to be within this safe and just space, or this donut? They calculate that it doesn't really work. So basically, you cannot not trespass. There is no cases where there is no physical boundaries that are trespassed while achieving high levels of social outcome. So in that sort of mathematization, they also find that there are some cases that seems a bit to stand out. So like Vietnam, for instance, there is quite a high level of social threshold that are achieved, and few biophysical boundaries that are transgressed. And that leads to the hypothesis that, okay, maybe there's like different sort of provisioning system that link these two things. And provisioning system is like a bit this black box that we need to open to understand better why there's different outcomes in different countries. So in their framework, there is this idea that there is like physical and social provisioning system, or at least components within those, that needs us to understand a bit better what are the infrastructure, the technology, the type of land use, and also socially, which kind of state, market, community role are underlying the way we provision for the needs. The fact of having different sort of location on the graph allows for asking questions of which would be the underlying provisioning system that exists. And in a sense, it's also strategically, I think, quite an efficient sort of research agenda, So rather than saying it's dramatic, there is also, we need the social outcomes. So it's also constructive. It can bring in a lot of people that could have sort of anti-environmentalist arguments of saying it's either or. And let's prioritize people, and like, even if in the future it leads to other things, a lot of anti-environmentalist, pro-market people can actually use these arguments. So here it's about more trying to unpack what is underlying these provision processes. But in a way, provisioning systems are also this kind of black box that connects the two, and that haven't really been studied that much. So there is also a need to really understand and dive into the process that would connect these things, and understand why different levels are reached, and even different social sort of outcome could be reached differently. And different resource use could lead to different outcomes. So even in the negative way, not only trying to look at the best example, we can understand a little bit more. Yeah. So in that way, I think it's quite an interesting strategic research agenda. It makes it a bit more politically acceptable. But also in a way it opens for something more radical of post-capitalist structures of distribution. As there is no example now, we can also think about something a bit more radical that would allow us to be there. So even though it's politically kind of looking quite neat to be like, okay, but we need both of these things, we can also say at the basis of this, we need to think these systems as something that needs to radically be rethought. So there is quite a lot of research that kind of followed these. I think right now it's picking up a bit. I saw an analysis of provisioning system of care, kind of care systems for like daycare and things like that. But I'm going to talk a bit more about what was this kind of foundational work for the system of provisions. But before that, I just want to say a little bit more about this article that I shared with you. So provisioning system for a good life within planetary boundaries. So what they are doing is to look at what could be these different sort of theories that could look into this provisioning system. So if I'm presenting today a bit more about systems of provision, there is a big difference between system of provision and provisioning systems. And what they do in this is that they say we identify 28 kind of theory that look at provisioning system, but we focus on 6. And we look at them through the lens of resource use and social outcome, and try to see actually how is it relevant to the objective of the agenda that I just described. So they conclude that none of these 6 are satisfactory by their own as a sort of single theory to solve the puzzle of the donut. But what they do is that they look through 5 criteria to analyze the theory in terms of the scope of the theory, the elements and relationship that the theory identify, the vision of how change happens, the insights on sustainable resource use. And the last and 5th criteria is the understanding of sufficient social outcome. Yeah. So I think that I will go a little bit quickly through these 6 different approach, but they are huge literature in themselves. So it's not really possible to go through completely now. And I know a little bit more the one in green and in blue. So in green, these 2 approaches emerge from science, technology, and society, the field. So it's a lot focused, especially the complex adaptive system is a lot about adaptation process inspired by evolutionary economics. The second one, multi-level perspective on transition, is a lot this idea of how specific innovation can create a movement from a niche to a regime. So something that is marginal and becomes more general. So it evolves in a sort of micro space and becomes a macro transformation. But there is a specific sort of set of keywords in this approach around resilience practices and lock-in that are quite characteristic of the STS, and maybe a little bit less political than what is in blue and other type of approach that might be a bit more fitting with a critique of capitalism. It places also a lot of kind of aspiration and innovation, but innovation is not necessarily defined in a very specific way. So in purple, we have the social ecological system framework. It's a bit of a formalization of the resource use through the concept also of governance. And it starts with with Ostrom and her conception of institution. So how different institution leads to different outcome as well, and different type of resource use. So commons obviously take a big share in this, and it can be quite useful in order to think about state provisioning, common provisioning versus private provisioning as leading to different outcome in connecting the two. So in connecting resource use and need satisfaction. In blue, I would say that it's a bit more socioeconomic system analysis inspired from heterodox perspective. That's also what they say, so I'm not inventing this. The social provisioning perspective is economic as the study of social provisioning determined by social structures. And it's pluralist, so it kind of builds from different heterodox schools. And the system of provision approach is what I will detail a bit more, but it's an analysis that is a little bit more commodity or service specific in trying to find the roots into the economic system processes that lead to certain consumption outcome. The two in blue are a bit more fitted, let's say, with the analysis of power relation and the contradictions that would emerge within capitalist structure. So in orange, the last one is theories of practice, and that's from the field of sustainable consumption. So it's a critical take on consumption, and it's quite focused on norms, competencies, routines, and how they generate certain consumptions or allow for or limit sustainable consumption practices, but also on symbolic meaning. So norm and symbolic meaning as well take quite a big role. So they outline these, and if I take a little critical, let's say, look at their interpretation, I think that so one of the things they say is that these are a bit these are theories, but I think they are more analytical approach or way to approach a question rather than a theory per se. So that maybe is one of my critique. But also I think there is, to a certain extent, the relevance of this approach is in being able to adapt to specific questions. And if the question is as general as resource use and planetary constraint, maybe it's harder to identify which of these 6 approaches is useful, because it's a huge question. So maybe it would need to be a little bit unpacked in order to make a truer assessment of the usefulness of these 6 theories. And yeah, so here we could maybe consider these a bit more as like a toolbox from which we can kind of build, and that might be more or less relevant to specific purpose. That would all possibly answer to the general question of how resource use and need satisfaction could be connected. But yeah, I think that maybe a last element is that they judge them compared to how they are useful for both the need sides and the use side. So maybe one thing that is important is to make sure that these approaches are used in a way that sees them as sees this system as being embedded. So that's a strong proposition of the ecological economic framework, that social structures and in the economy are all embedded within planetary processes. And so in a sense, to say it's only good at doing the social, or it's only good at doing the ecological, is also something we can think about, or at least the connection can emerge once we better understand, maybe, for example, only the social process. We can then understand, or we can push this to also see how it's embedded into the ecological system. So here they say it's either useful for one or for the other, but I would think maybe there is a way to think about this a little bit differently if we start with this idea of embeddedness. But for sure, the key concepts of the approach can limit the capacity to see those connections. So in that way, it's not completely irrelevant. So maybe to summarize a little bit what they do in this article is that they don't just do this kind of overview of the different approach, they also propose something. So they summarize the theories by kind of proposing to actually to create yeah, so they say that what is useful from these different approach or theory is to then propose, they identify core institution, household, market, the common, the state, and technological elements, so material stock and the techniques that allow for more or less resource efficiency. So they take this from these approach. They say these would be the foundational sort of concept that we would use to summarize what is proposed. And then we would use them to compare and define provisioning system. And they also say that it's really important to still take into account feedback effects that would emerge and power relations that would structure these things. So that's a little bit the summary of what they say, like how to summarize and take the key points from these 6 theories. And then it's quite aligned with the research agenda that was already in place. So the idea of mapping need satisfier horizontally would be one of the starting point of how to use this summary that they propose. And they say that there is not only provisioning system, but appropriating systems where rent extraction would need to lead to negative results. So if provisioning is something positive, there is also appropriating system that would be the one maybe more characteristic of what leads to these high resource use and these low need satisfaction levels. Yeah. So their general critique of the approach is that there is there's little kind of pointers of how to overcome the processes, and quite a limited discussion on the biophysical aspect. I think that how to overcome these processes is a huge question. I think it's a good critique. But I think this is maybe where the next sort of generation of research in this kind of needs to go. And I will talk a little bit more about this in relation to the system of provision approach. But now I'll really focus on this one approach. So it's one of the 6. I wanted to also give you this other article because it says that it's not the only one. And it says there are different ways to look at it. But this is the one I know the most, and I'm kind of curious to explore. So I'll start with this quote. So the question of who has what, why, and how and why is central to human existence. Fundamental aspects of our everyday lives, such as access to food, water, shelter, school, and health services, hinge on these on such issues. So yeah, I mean, that's also who gets what, how, and why is the question on the cover of the book, and quite a good summary of what the approach is trying to do. But trying to give a definition, it would go as follows. So a system of provision for a good or service is understood as the integral unity of the economic and social factor that goes into both its creation and its use. So here we know already that it's quite focused to a specific good or service. So that's already something that, so it anchors the analysis in a specific. Then it can compare different specific and try to find patterns of general sort of changed, but it's narrowed to this. So SOP is not only interested in how the consumer understands what is being consumed and the process leading to what is consumption, but also how other agents understand the process, whether in production, regulation, finance, or otherwise. So it locates into structures, into processes of capitalist production, so regulation as well. So here we see the very heterodox side. But in general, the approach has a strong theoretical heritage in Marxist political economy, notably with the concept of value theory, commodity fetishism, that position use and consumption into power structure of capitalism. And also, we will see a lot this Marxist undertone in the concept of material culture that is used in the approach. But just maybe to talk about the aim of the SOP, so it really aims at unpacking different things. So it aims at unpacking the opaque working of who gets what and how, as well as why. But also who is excluded from the consumption and what is the effect of that, which I think is particularly interesting. So if it's about also who is discriminated from the structure of current provision in capitalism, it can be both because of norms, way of framing who should deserve to be provided a good. And it comes with this idea of deserving and undeserving poor, or deserving and undeserving citizen or regions, which I think is fundamental to try to understand also need satisfaction in general, and which kind of channels of capitalism are favoring certain groups and not others. Another sort of unpacking that it does is to try to understand why outcome emerge and shift over time. So the transformation into historical processes. So why processes are configured in particular form, what underlies consumption and production decision, and the relationship between and around them. So there's quite a strong historical materialist, let's say, take on change. That is quite fruitful if we try to understand processes that have been established over quite a long run, and that leads to this outcome today. So the last unpacking is the black box that provides detail on structures, opposing interest, and range of practices within the sector, and about power that shapes provisioning processes. So here we find again this idea of the black box. I think it's a black box that they want from the perspective of Kate Bayliss and Ben Fine to open from the mainstream. But here we have it also as kind of the black box between resource use and social outcome. So there are 5 components for the system of provision. It is sort of synthesizing the complex driver of consumption into these 5 components. They are identified as being interrelated, and the boundaries between them being quite blurred or not necessarily straightforwardly delimited. So as kind of summary of how these core elements are described in the book is that the structures, agent, processes, and relation that constitute the chain of activity linking production to consumption, the consumption norms that they generate, the material culture in which they are attached, and situating the analysis in the context of both grander factors like globalization, neoliberalization, and financialization, but also the specific of the system of provision itself as being socially, historically, and locationally determined. So it's both specific and general. The general process lead to change that have concrete impact on at the local level and on social relation. It's not only that the frontier between these are blurred, but also what is being said is that it's important to highlight the contradiction that might be within them and among them. So as a sort of result of a system of provision approach analysis, it would be it's one of the type of results that is looked for is this kind of contradiction. What I will do now is that I will look at each of the 5 components to make a clear definition of both what is the definition, but also how they can be operationalized into an analysis. So starting with agent, it refers to the participation in economic activity from production to consumption, and it refers to individual participation and to groups action. So it can be a group, for instance, union, consumer group, or regulator. It includes consumer and producer, but also subgroup in those categories, so in the chain of production. And also groups that could be excluded, like some association or household that feel a need to claim back some space into those processes. Different type of organization also can be included, from private to public, but also philanthropic and other type of organization. And the state also plays a big role in regulating those structures, but also sometimes as being a very proactive financier, provider, property right agents, and policymaker. An important agent is also different type of actors like banks, the ILO or other union groups that represent kind of agents within those chains. They are also linked to broader institutions. Agent is said to be quite a good starting point to start mapping a system of provision. So if, for instance, I'm interested in the provision for housing in Montreal, who are the main agents in the system? What are the conflicting interests? What are the motives, the rationale that lead them to engage in the system of provision? Is a good starting point to already sort of map. And because of all of these components possibly being quite huge, maybe this is a bit more feasible, also kind of concrete who are part of that system is a good starting point also in that sense. The second component would be relations. So it's characterized by the exercise of power. So who, for which purpose, and in which meaning people exercise, power is being exercised. It's connected to decision-making process, activities of competition, contestation, and mediation. And in many sense, you would have agents with conflicting position, contradicting, that would be contradictory within the system. But the system sort of function under certain power relation that creates a certain stability as well within the provision, or create change or production and reproduction of the system itself. One way to operationalize the concept is also to observe the consumption trends, the cluster pattern, identify the social norms, and how they shape the other element. The third element is structure. So it's defined as a historically evolving and socially specific institutional form of provisioning. It includes institutional mechanism for provision, such as regulation, ownership, control, delivery. They can, so to operationalize the identification, it's quite useful to look into the origin of some structure. So why have some structure being built initially? How have they evolved? And how consumption might vary across different structural components, what impacts it has. In a way, we can say that there is a social structure will have a social outcome, and we can try to identify these social outcomes. The fourth one is processes. They are defined as shaped by the interaction of the activities of labor and customers, of service provider, of this and of the state. It includes concrete and abstract element that goes from advertising to globalization. So one thing that is quite interesting is that they highlight already as sort of a result that neoliberalization played a strong role in the individualizing and responsibilization of social provision. So how with neoliberal discourse, there have been sort of this fragmentation, this sort of implementation of individual-based sort of idea on provision. And if you don't consume, it's because you are responsible. So this kind of responsibilization. Also, another sort of result is that financialization itself also has a grander trend, has profoundly influenced the practices and effect on social reproduction, leading to quite a rise of inequality. So we can think about speculation in housing that has quite an impact on inequality. So reducing maybe accessibility for lower bracket and increasing profit at the top. How to operationalize it is maybe to convey a second level of analysis, where after understanding agent structure and relation, you try to understand how processes might impact or have made these evolve. The last component is material culture. So I said this is quite linked to the Marxist heritage, but it also in general kind of echoes a rich interdisciplinary discussion on consumption with fields of sociology and other fields that have been also looking into questions of consumption. And it points to the different meanings that agent might have for a specific good or service, and how narrative are produced and reproduced. It also says that what is produced is consumed very differently. So the meaning of mining, food, and water is quite distinct. And it's important to understand this material culture aspect in order to take into account these differences. It's also embedded in specific cultural significance. So saying the most sustainable way to consume would be to do this or that is often actually coming with a very strong bias on consumption or cultural understanding of things. We can talk about a cycling bias where a cycling lane is the only solution, but actually that's very specific to a city understanding of what sustainability is. So culture are generated and perpetuated by a variety of discourse. This is what we're interested in here. And they are susceptible to direct attempts to exert influence. So we can think about advertising, political, and other type of campaigning as being essential to understand the other component. And here's why material culture has to be added in the system of provision. Also, we can think about what maybe before was named in the other article, appropriating system versus provisioning system, to the concept of material culture. They don't do this distinction in the provisioning system. They don't do a sort of value judgment of what is a good provisioning system. They look at the outcome afterward, or they look at the structure to think about it critically. But here you would think about material culture as maybe creating spurious consumption, or profit-making spurious consumption legitimate within a structure because of material culture type of discourse and narrative, as being also something that coexists with essential needs type of provisions. A way to operationalize the concept is to unpack the different narrative and meaning, and look a bit at how they are contested or changing, transformed also, with different structure, with the other component. So the SOP starts with these 5 components, and then what it's proposing is, they say that it's both a vertical and horizontal analysis of the provisioning process. So by vertical, they talk more about what we would consider the sort of standard economic process of production, distribution, consumption, and disposal. So it's this kind of chain of activity that is seen as the vertical process. And the horizontal would be socioeconomic variables. So race, income, gender, that would lead to different sort of group benefiting or not from the structure that exists. So an example of this that is taken from Kate Bayliss, one of her presentation, is that you have the vertical chain of provision with that goes from customer, retailer, distributor, manufacturer, and financier, and it goes in both ways. And horizontally, you would have structure and processes that would be historically and context specific, and that would lead to different sort of group receiving or not benefiting from this chain, from this vertical chain. And material cultures go everywhere in that structure. It might be a lot because we don't see it with a very concrete example, but I'm two slides away from giving concrete example of how to use the system of provision approach. But just to come a bit more into like how to do SOP. First is that it's seen as an approach, not necessarily a methodology, and in that sense, it's open to a diversity of method, theory, concepts, and methodology. So this also, to a certain extent, give it the possibility to cohabit with other approach and build from other understanding, other literature. One example of a theory that can be used is the global value chain or global production network type of literature, which would actually have a lot to say about this vertical chain or vertical aspect of the analysis. And when we think about method, some that I know Kate Bayliss is using is and used simultaneously is an investigation of accounting books of companies matched with interviews of other agents in the system of provision, and triangulation with different literature that already kind of built historical insights on the situation, how it evolved, how it was built. The approach is inductive, so in contrast to the mainstream approach, and iterative, which implies that there is not necessarily an initial research question or set of hypotheses, but rather it's identify area of investigation And it's iterative in the sense that it's non-linear. So you go, you investigate, you identify some things, and then you can bounce back and narrow the area of investigation or the research question you actually want to investigate. And so how to operationalize it, I said it a bit with the different components of like how they can be identified, but I think there is a bit more. So more generally, one of the challenges is really that the boundary are not necessarily clear with this aspect that it's iterative, but also a system of provision can be such a large machine, let's say, and it's hard to say this is where the machine ends. So they do mention that this is actually one of the greatest challenges, that it's not necessarily clear from the outset that where it ends, where it begins, and there are choices to make. And also these choices can be made by the specific research agenda. So for them, it's not necessarily something they can predetermine and say this is the rules of how it should be. But there are some tips. One thing that makes it a bit more manageable is this thing of starting with agents and trying to interview as many people as possible to really try to get all the perspective and not necessarily be surprised with that at a later stage. One thing that I think is quite interesting is to say that it's a way into telling a story. You don't necessarily you cannot necessarily say the whole story, but you can say what are the highlights or what are the important components of a system of provision, and identify patterns that are worth summarizing. That are a way to summarize this story. So I'm going to give example now, but if there are questions about the sort of theory of how to do, I'm glad also to respond. Maybe questions will emerge when it comes to the reality of analysis. So the article, the second article I shared was this one. So inequality, poverty, and privatization of essential service. It's really looking at water, energy, and local buses in the context of the UK. And they look at the last decade, or especially post-2008. And it's like decades in which the state progressively removed its participation from provisioning process and structures in the UK. And there are many dramatic sort of impact of this. Reports of extreme poverty in the UK by UN advisor, things like that that also brought to the public understanding that change in provisioning system to a certain extent can lead to dramatic outcome and dramatic change or backward sort of step into the capacity of people to access these basic services. There's also an interesting comparison, because if in Wales and England there have been this state progressively being removed, in Scotland there was less so. And actually we see that public provisioning plays a big role in Scotland and creates a different sort of story. So there is also this comparison that is made in the article. So what they highlight in the article is the role in the system of provision for these three service of technocratic solution. The other thing is the privatization over the medium or long run. So we have that maybe in the short term, the aim was to stimulate competition and remove the role of the state, create more space for market competition. So the private actors to come into the provision for water, for instance. But in the long run, it creates monopoly and specific sort of disinvestment. The case of the bus routes or the transport is there. So they thought maybe by introducing more private actors, the different companies would compete to each other, and that would maybe have a positive impact on the provision, lower prices, and these kind of market assumptions that through competition you can have better outcomes. But what we saw is, it was true at the start, there was a little bit of this bus war competition between transport providers, but in the longer or even in the medium run, very quickly, there was a consolidation, a monopolization of these transport routes to what was seen as more economically efficient. So cities where there is a lot of people commuting on a daily basis became well deserved by the transport companies, but routes that were maybe less frequent or more for leisure or for visiting, like inter-regional commuting, were worse off afterward. Then profit maximization under financialization really reduced affordability. So one of the things that was highlighted in the article is the fact that transmission and distribution of electricity is now under the London Stock Exchange. So we go from traditional infrastructure company that are replaced by financial investors. And in that way, we face fully this aspect of financialization. And this financial investor wants to create a certain type of deal, and the only sort of solution for some of the people wanting to benefit from these is to sometimes have to unplug, basically. So they go off grid whenever they can, and they plug back in to try to then have the service, but there is no capacity to have the affordable price. So they have to cut on use in a way that is not the one promoted by this kind of donut framework. Yeah. So it reinforces inequality and limits general access to service. So the coverage of the service also shrinks. Then the type of population that can benefit from the service also shrinks. So lower income in many of these. So in all of the three spheres that they analyzed, all don't get discriminated against. Yeah, so for example, this thing of unplugging, going off grid with energy or water is kind of the only solution. Some of the things also are like packages that people, not everyone has the same access to information. So even if companies can say no, but we are offering something, it's not everyone that benefits from it. For these kind of reduced package, these kind of financial sort of incentive to sort of create this idea of choice for the customers. So overall, the conclusion is that the interest of producer and financial investor has surpassed the interest of customers. And there is this narrative of individual responsibility and false notion of choice that emerge, and sort of put the responsibility on the individual rather than saying it's structural, it's the provisioning system that is now failing. It's these private companies that are pushing individual to unplug, to go off grid. It's not a choice necessarily as we could define it if we were critical. There is a good representation that they do of the system of provision. So they map different type of agents, state and regulator, provider, and financial investors that are now a little bit the same sort of category. I see maybe it's a little bit small. So here we have financial investors and providers and customers. So they are linked. They have specific relation that exists. But they are also grouped with specific vested interest and objectives. And then we have different processes and narrative. So narrative here, it goes to the material culture aspect. So privatization is one of these processes, and it's justified by the idea of private efficiency narrative. We have also a justification for deregulation based on this idea of market competition. So the example of the bus, for instance, that they would compete, there would be a bus war, they would compete to each other, and it would be okay then to deregulate. So very pro-market vision. And the last sort of narrative of the emo economicus, in which consumers is responsible for its own welfare via the market, rather than questioning whether even the market can provide welfare. And yeah, so those are the elements that the fifth element, we can see how they can be sort of synthesized. And yeah, the reality that are uncovered by the SOP is that there is this process of rent extraction. There are powerful private incumbents that have the strong market ideology, and there's this lobbying also of the private sector. And we see that as a result of these processes, we have increase in cost and decrease in accessibility also, as I said before, and increase in inequality. So that was one of the illustration of how it has been applied. Another one, to go maybe briefly and give just another example, is on car dependency. So that's another research that has been done. And what they say is that there's like 5 constituents, according to them, according to the analysis using the system of provision, that map a bit or identify why there is a car dependence of the system, of the transport system. So first one, they look into the automobile industry, and what they say is that the car manufacturing shapes a lot how the system work. There's a lot of economies of scale that exist in car production that leads to a push for overproduction and overconsumption, because then you want to benefit from those economies of scale, those large production. Another component is that the provision of car infrastructure becomes narrowly defined toward road construction. It becomes the role of the state, so it's subsidized, let's say, to the state. So we pay for the construction of roads, and it affects land use and the configuration of cities, the configuration of space. So the infrastructure also here plays a big role in explaining the car dependence. Another component is the political economy of urban sprawl and consumption culture that is associated to the living standard promoted by suburban life. The fourth aspect on 5 is the provision of public transport that becomes a bit disinvested, especially in regions where things are more built around the car, so it goes the other component. And a concentration of investment also toward roads rather than toward public infrastructure or public transport infrastructure. They also talk about different type of cultures of consumption that are quite important to sustain this type of provision or this type of political economy of car dependence. So here again, it shows a little bit how things should benefit from being interrelated. So the infrastructure, the spatial configuration, but also the type of production or manufacturing of car. I'm using here also what Kate Bayliss presented as why using the SOP approach can be valid. So this would be a bit my last slide before opening up for discussion. What she says is that the SOP approach has the advantage of being kind of a holistic, systemic, inductive framing, which allows for incorporation of other contribution. So I know, for instance, the article on car consumption was made by somebody who was quite an expert on the car literature, but not on the system of provision. And it was a way to organize some of the literature as well that existed into something that makes it a bit more comprehensive of the pressure or structural components that lead to certain outcome. Then the SOP approach joins up segments that are not usually connected, so that echoes to some of the critique of maybe how mainstream economics would see consumption, but also how sometime in other fields some of the production processes, distribution processes that are central to economic activities are a bit pushed aside. So some of these studies on sustainable consumption could be a little bit about, let's say, narrowly focus on social norms of consumption, but also how these norms are created is also because they are a producer and because there is lobbying interests and agents that push for these to arise. So here the links that I'm making are a bit the one that could be fruitful for our conversation. They're not the one that she advised for. The third element is that the SOP approach exposes the contradiction and contestation that are often hidden in the workings of the underlying system. Contradictions between agents. I think here what could be interesting to say is that these contradictions can also be leverage point for alternative ways of provisioning. So identifying how maybe you have strong power in the hands of some people, but actually strong contestation and contradiction that emerge could be these kind of leverage points to change the structure of provision. So rather than only seeing it as a sort of negative assessment, this contradiction can lead to thinking about how change can also occur. System approach, it's not just interested in what the system look at, but also why it takes the form that it does. So here's kind of the ultimate hope of many economists to have this kind of causal relation, but I think by unpacking the power relation, you can have more whys than many other type of analyses. The SOP approach accommodates the complexity and contested roles of agents in shaping material culture. And lastly, SOP approach can indicate leverage point for change. Here, I think what is, I mean, this last point is mentioned a couple of times in the book, but it's not necessarily defined. So I think that's also maybe our role if we are interested in building from that approach or the insights of the approach to think about what this means concretely, which leverage point for change, and how we can identify it through the 5 components, for instance. So that leads us a bit to talk about the discussion, or discuss the discussion. And I wanted to kick it off a little bit with this idea of leverage point. So the SOP approach highlights the extensive and complex channel which underpins specific social, environmental, and economic outcome, and can therefore be helpful to identifying leverage point for intervention and pressure for change. So this kind of transformational change, this idea that it could be used, is also what led a lot of these ecological economics picking up this approach and trying these things. The car dependence one is a clear way of talking also about unsustainable consumption. But the how are still maybe to be defined. I have a couple of questions, but we don't necessarily have to follow this to structure our conversation. So yeah, so from now on, it's a little bit more like mic on, let's discuss. But maybe just wanting to check if there are like questions already about the SOP, like does it make sense, what was presented, or maybe even just by formulating what you think is the potential of SOP that also allows you to feel a bit in your words what the SOP can do. Which elements are fruitful, which are shortcomings. Another question that maybe I want to pose is the critique of finding that it kind of lacks the proposive element of how to change structure. Do you think that that holds for the SOP? And how maybe we can actually use the SOP to make it fitted in reconciling resource use and social needs. I'm not going to read them all because I think the more I talk, the less you talk. But I'm also interested in connecting it with the discussion on post-capitalist economy and the criteria proposed by the team. So I'm going to stop sharing.